Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Neurodivergent Advantage with myself, Leslie Buckman. This podcast, it is designed to educate, to build awareness, create conversation, but also to spark thought and to be able to hear back from you, because when we talk about neurodivergence, everyone is different. That's the point. It doesn't mean that just because someone is autistic that they will be like someone else who is autistic. This whole purpose is to start creating different language, different dialogue, and to break out of assumptions and expectations that put people in boxes. Now, today, I'm going to go through masking and ableism because they are directly connected. And what we're going to go through is, and I've been writing again in my pad, do you ever have when you're really hyper-focused, really in and just getting everything out? And this is why I encourage you, if there's something you're really passionate about, to literally put pen to paper, because it allows things to flow very differently from if you're typing or texting. So aspects that I'm going to cover in this episode are: why do neurodivergents mask at work? We're going to go through examples of masking, the cost, and then we're going to work through looking at how ableism connects with this and directly. We're going to look at externalized ableism and internalized, and then we're going to finish with connecting this all back to the workplace. And look, these are also things that can be applied in the home and society, community, schools, but we're going to look at how to overcome masking and ableism in the workplace. So there's a number of different tips there to offer support, suggestions, guidance, and I would love to hear from you in additional ways that you view can actually support this further. So to take you back to the start, let's look at why people may mask. And, let's start with what masking is. Masking is that feeling, and building on from our last episode on normal perceptions and societal expectations. It is when someone feels the need to essentially suppress who they really are, whether it be the way they communicate, the way that they process, their stimming, repetitive movements, and whatever it is a way that we feel that we literally have to put a mask on to be accepted into the world. Now, why neurodivergents are likely to have to feel they need to do this in the workplace? Number one, to fit in, to avoid stigma, because it is proven statistically that stigma, despite awareness, stigma and discrimination is on the increase towards neurodivergent individuals. This means we sometimes need to mask to fit in, to avoid judgment, to avoid being harassed, bullied, targeted. There's so many different ways. It essentially comes down to social survival. Now, it means masking because of judgment and expectations. Sometimes an individual may feel that to be able to progress in any environment, and they need to fit. This comes from a lack of understanding of different ways of communicating and thinking in that larger environment. And this is why we talk about needing greater awareness, greater patience, a greater ability to really listen and take on board different views, different ways of being, without fitting everything into how a person thinks or feels. So some person has an expectation of, right, normal is this. We need to remove that. There is not a normal. There is a majority, as we've covered before. So masking is a learned strategy to suppress natural behaviors to meet societal expectations. And honestly, that is exhausting. And how sad is that people feel like they need to literally squash themselves into a box to be able to be accepted or spoken to like a human being? Examples of masking for you to be aware of. So, this is for you if you're listening and you're trying to learn more about neurodivergence, or even for you as in awareness if you might be masking, because I'll tell you what, one thing that impacts whether or not someone may be aware if they're literally squashing themselves down into a behavior that might be more acceptable. We don't always know it because it may be so ingrained and from childhood that the person may think that is their natural behavior. But there's things that show up and that are telltale signs. So, for example, examples, forcing yourself to sit still. Now, this would have come from the school age, because can you imagine if you're someone that needs to move around a lot and you did that at school? What happens? You get told to sit still, be quiet, not speak, and to listen. Because the assumption is if you're moving, you're not listening, when in fact, sometimes it actually helps people to focus more. Now, another one, refraining from interrupting, because again, we are taught and social expectations is that if you are interrupting, it is classed as rude. I get that. And in fact, this is something I very much work on when I'm working in the communication space, is sometimes it does come across like you are not listening to the other person when you continually interrupt and take away from that person. However, neurodivergent communication is very different. If you sit down with, I'll give you an example. If you sit down with very chatty neurodivergent, and I was nearly going to say extroverted, but I chose not to, because you might have someone that is perceived as introverted by people. They might be quiet, but then when you get individuals that are really passionate about different subjects, they don't have to waste time with small talk, asking how's the weather, and they get straight into their special interests. Like, they are on fire and they know so much and they're so passionate. So what you will notice is that their way of relating can also be one person will share something, then the next person will share something else without necessarily acknowledging, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying, and talking around that. So things are very, very different in the way that people communicate in here. Now, the other way is suppressing repetitive movements. I've already covered forcing yourself to sit still, but again, this comes through from a long period of time. It might be if someone's twirling their hair, or it might be if someone is clicking their pen. All these little things, or tapping their feet. Repetitive movements that release this excess of energy, and it allows, again, like I said, with sitting still, this is the same thing, repetitive movements, and it also could be repetitive languaging as well. Mimicking social cues and ways of communicating, because we are not given a handbook on how to communicate. And then we are seen as different because our social cues are different from neurotypical, the majority, and of what is perceived as normal. Now, for me, I remember as a kid, now you've got to remember, for me, I'm 45 and I was only diagnosed a couple of years ago, and it literally was like the missing piece of the puzzle. Suddenly everything made sense. When I was younger, I would really struggle with anything like communicating with other people. I would get accused of making weird faces, and always on the outside. So what I used to do was actually study body language. Even as a kid, my dad used to have this book on body language, which I found fascinating. So I would learn about responses, around what acceptable expressions are, how to communicate, and all of this side of things, so that I could know how I should be responding to someone to be accepted. So that's what I mean when we talk about mimicking social cues. It's learning what the norm is and expectations and trying to mimic that so you appear as normal. It's like putting on this this mask. It's this whole different persona to be viewed and accepted. The cost is actually huge. So even if you haven't realized that you're in fact masking because it's been so conditioned and just feels natural, it's just what you do, the cost is huge, mentally, physically, emotionally, acceptance of yourself. And I'll go through a few. One is burnout, because you're hiding who you are deep in your heart, at your core. You're literally, if you've ever tried to, even for a short time, try and act a certain way that doesn't fit, it really affects you. And you can only do it for a certain amount of time. But imagine if you have to keep on doing that year after year after year. It is exhausting. Now, one thing that I do want to mention, because even as I'm going through this, it's all, I guess, giving the perception that masking is a bad thing. And yes, it can be because of its cost, because of its impact. However, there's something that I want you to consider, is that sometimes people mask because it feels safer, because sometimes not fitting in can be really harsh, because then it leads to judgment, bullying, not fitting. That can be absolutely brutal. As you and I know, the amount of victimization, unkindness to people that are different is disgusting. So sometimes it is safer for someone to mask to fit in. That's why we do it. And that is why it's so important for there to be safe spaces and places of understanding, awareness, so we can work on this, so more people can actually feel more accepted. And it brings the whole difference of conversation, knowledge, brain types, all to the forefront, because that is when we are at our best. So the next one is the exhaustion. So we talk about obviously burnout, and that connects directly to the level of exhaustion on trying to falsify who you are. It also increases anxiety and depression. It raises level of panic. Now, it also brings in that reduced psychological safety, because it breaks down a person's trust in themselves, who they are. Because can you imagine feeling like you're not good enough or worthwhile as the real you, and the long-term impact of that? It also creates a lack of trust in the environment around you. This, if you've got to continually go into somewhere day after day where it drains you and you're not happy and you have to put on a front, And you know that the second, that mask slipped, that there would be a certain response, but not necessarily. And I'll come into this, because when things are handled in the right way and with respect and dignity and understanding of differences, it can be so powerful. And there's also, I know when I say this on how people judge and can be cruel, by the same other side of the coin, there's some amazing people who are good, who are inclusive, who are really genuine, who are supportive, and it's really important to find those people. The next point that I've got here is, when you don't feel like you connect with people as who you are, what it does is it erodes genuine connection. And as social beings, that can make us feel really isolated. We need genuine connection. That's one thing that really boosts a person, can really lift someone up. Identity crisis. Really having a loss and a sense of self. If you're constantly trying to falsify who you are, you might get to a point when you're like, well, I don't even know what I stand for. I don't know who I am. This is where your boundaries won't be as strong. This is where you may not advocate for yourself. You won't stand by what you view. And it also means you won't be able to find, or as likely, should I say, to find things that light you up, because you don't trust in yourself to follow your gut, your instinct. The feeling of being misunderstood in life. When you're masking, you're hiding struggles which can prevent support. It also means if you are someone that really perhaps needs a diagnosis, again, that's a whole other topic. Some people are self-diagnosed, some people formally diagnosed. Some people don't want to be diagnosed, that it's a personal preference. But if you are someone who feels like going through it and getting support in the process of being assessed, when you're really masking, it can delay that process and diagnosis, and in turn, support and strategies to cope and grow. Loss of functioning. Burnout, and think about this, if you've ever had burnout, how does it impact you in daily life? For me, things that have come up, a few years ago when I had burnout, is I could hardly string a sentence together. Like, my brain function just shut down. I couldn't do simple tasks. It's even, on how you respond and your level of patience with others around you. So really consider how it impacts daily life. Now we're going to go on to now ableism. And as you can see, these are massive topics and there's so much more that we can go into here. But what I want to do is condense it at a high level here, so we can perhaps unpack as we move further along. And also, if you have questions that you want to ask or put your views across, I'd love to hear from them so we can really shape what's relevant to you. Now, how does ableism connect? Firstly, let's talk about what ableism is. It is a discrimination and social prejudice based on the belief that neurotypical brains are superior to neurological differences. Essentially, it is privilege and power over those that don't fit with societal expectations. There is both external and externalized ableism and internalized. And again, they're very connected. You notice everything we talk about here is so intertwined, and there's a variety of different ways that, it can be approached and discussed. Externalized ableism. This is social exclusion and bullying of a person because they don't fit into neurotypical expectations. Some examples. Institutionalized barriers, which are education and employment. So think about this. I already mentioned one example, and that is perception on how a child needs to behave in the classroom, as in you have to sit still, you have to be quiet, you can't ask questions. But in fact, that all takes away from really enhancing a person's self-worth, being able for them to discover who they are at their core, to learn about themselves, to advocate for themselves, to ask questions, to speak up on what they need. So that's a big one. So it's looking at education and employment, refusing reasonable accommodation, having conventional hiring practices that disadvantage neurodivergent candidates. So you would notice some recruitment processes, they have a series of questions, very specific things where if you don't answer in the right way, you could be marked down. Same as in school. If you don't answer a question in the right way, even though you get to the same outcome, you can be penalized for it. Healthcare. And like I say, all of these massive topics in themselves. So we'll be going further in all of these in other episodes. Healthcare, lack of proper training in neurodiversity. Now, how this could impact is leading to misdiagnosis or focusing on curing difference. And for me, I can very much relate to this, as when I went through my diagnosis, it was a difficult process. Even though I'd had the initial conversations with my wonderful psychologist, And how it came about was because of noticing things my eldest daughter, and I have got permission from her to discuss this, permission from others to speak about their side of the story and how they're connected is absolutely crucial. The doctor that I saw, even though I had this great big long list of examples of behaviors, things that come up for me, the impact, everything, the response was that he actually said, I refuse to put down a referral for autism or ADHD because that is overdiagnosed. And it's a buzzword and it's a trend. And this was heartbreaking. But what was worse is when I looked at the referral form, he'd written on it a referral for anxiety and depression. And honestly, I just laughed then, because it's like, well, hold on. You've just said you won't refer for this, which I have a list of aspects that show up in my traits that you believe is overdiagnosed, but then anxiety and depression, they're not overdiagnosed. So this is where, if I didn't have an incredible psychologist that I'd already been speaking to with a really deep understanding of neurodivergence, this could actually have been soul destroying, because I would have taken their word for it, and it could have really impacted. So, and as well for the fact I'm quite an outspoken person. If it was with someone that was really uncertain in themselves, really struggling, that could have been absolutely soul destroying. I mean, it was for me, but the level of how misunderstanding or not the proper training, it really is so impactful in a very negative way. So, other ways of ableism, externalized, is microaggressions. So this is subtle everyday comments. It could be something like, if you have just shared that you have had a diagnosis, for example, and you have responses of, oh, everyone's a bit autistic, or you don't look autistic. Isn't it just a trend? Or, oh, you're ADHD. Are you sure it's not just, why can't you just act normal? All these things really add on. Another example is lowered expectations. So well-meaning authoritative figures could underestimate a neurodivergent's personality potential, which may limit their own ability to then achieve and growth. Internalized ableism. Now, this is the way that an individual absorbs externalized ableism and puts it within themselves. That can display as negative self-talk, as in, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm not enough, I'm a failure, I don't fit in, I'm not communicating how I should. And when we have the negative self-talk literally perpetuating in mind, now think about this, we are geared to having a negative frame of things. 80% of thoughts are on a negative angle versus 20% on positive. So it can be really hard to counteract this. So this internalized ableism, this is why it's so important to really look at shifting culture, shifting society, shifting the way we speak about it, because it impacts people in a very, very deep way. Now, the negative self-talk is one thing, believing things that you've heard and perhaps things that are false because they're shaped from someone else's view and someone else's understanding. So if they haven't received any awareness, respect, appreciation of differences, that is then put on you. But it's what you choose to do with it is really important. Next one is minimizing needs. Masking. Obviously, that is the direct impact from the internalized ableism. We mask to fit. Minimizing needs, as in if someone is telling you that there is actually nothing wrong, and you know what, there is nothing wrong. But I'm talking about generic languaging that we sometimes hear when puts people in boxes of in something wrong with you or not wrong with you. It can influence your ability to ask for what you need, to ask for accommodations, as in if you know you really struggle on trying to work and be all in for 8 hours, if your brain shuts down, or if you physically struggle, but you're told that these are the requirements and it's non-negotiable, then you try and force yourself. Then you'll get to the end of the day and be absolutely depleted. Your performance will drop and you won't ask for what you need because you've been told that it's this way or the highway. Imposter syndrome. This can come across in two ways, and it's obviously all connected to that inner self-talk on, number one, believing that you don't fit in the neurotypical society. And you might not even use those terms, but it's that general sense of not fitting. But also on top of that, if you're then told, you don't seem like you've got anything that you've spoken about. You don't seem like you've got autism. You don't seem like you've got ADHD, OCD. All of these, if someone is putting their projections on you, you then have not only where you don't fit in the neurotypical world, you then question if you even fit in the neurodivergent world. So you're then kind of like lost in the middle, this limbo land. Then we go through onto the shame and inadequacy. If you're constantly telling yourself you're not good enough, that you're broken, you feel like you're not enough, and that applies through everything. So there's a couple of ways that we need to consider, because all of these are really crucial on looking at how we overcome masking and ableism in workplaces, and yes, society, home, everywhere. Right now, I am focusing on the workplace, but these are things that can be applied, as I mentioned before. It's got to be a dual approach, as in, number one, strategies for the person themselves, for the individual, supporting confidence, building self-advocacy, self-trust. Now, the other one, the second, is creating a genuinely inclusive environment. And I say genuinely because it's not about just having the word neurodiverse put on your website. It's not about doing a couple of workshops here and then and you get back to the old way of doing things. Let's talk about the first one first. That was a terrible sentence, I know. And that's on the individual. It's looking at people being able to gradually unmask in safe environments around people that create a safe space. Non-judgmental, inclusive, that beautiful recognition of different strengths, different traits, appreciating the different personality styles and different ways of communicating, and really encouraging that. Next one is prioritizing self-care and regulation of the nervous system. Do you have in place even the conversation around well-being, around what it's like to be your best within yourself, your healthiest? Because it's not just something that goes separately within the workplace. It's not just, okay, here we talk about tasks, doing, and outside of work is all the well-being stuff. It's nothing to do with that. We need to consider the whole person, which means the better a person is, the more that they have health, well-being, a balanced nervous system, the better they can function. So prioritizing self-care is really important. Now, next is developing self-awareness. So if you can see someone is struggling, but perhaps you sense that they might not know where to start, it's actually not just telling them, oh, this is how you are, this is how you should be, this is, well, I say observations are useful. However, it's being able to prompt and ask questions. So this is why being really looking at a coaching style of leadership is really important, because asking questions to allow a person to build the self-trust and insights from within themselves is really important to develop their own awareness of who they are. Self-advocacy is enabling your people to learn how to communicate their needs and their boundaries with confidence. And also to start off with that is even to be able to identify them. And lastly, I've noted on seeking professional support for your staff and yourself. We are human beings. We need continual growth, continual development. If we stay still, we grow stagnant. There is always room to grow. You can never know enough. You can never know everything. So it's for yourself and your people, looking at that development. Now, when we talk about organizational strategies, this is the second part. And all are equally important. This is where we look at promoting awareness and education of different communication styles, talking about what stereotypes are. I'm trying to move away from them, looking at why it's important, where it comes from, because these are systemized and these have come through from centuries of perceptions, different leadership styles that have embodied this in communication, the community, society, the workplace. So being able to unpack and unravel what has come through from centuries, it's no small task, but it has to start somewhere. And that starts by not telling people, right, this is how we're going to be. It's actually looking at, okay, what's our current reality? Where do people experience and feel safe to talk? And hearing from them as where the improvements could be made, and not just denying it or rejecting it straight off, taking it on board where it comes from and why, and what the ideal is. Now, this takes us on to looking at redefining what professionalism looks like, or moving away from judging a person on mannerisms, because sometimes, again, this comes back to how we're brought up. When you're told that professionalism looks like a certain behavior, anything outside of that is then assigned with a level of judgment, whether you realize it or not. So it's looking at, okay, how can we redefine what professionalism looks like in our environment, in our society? What does it mean? Because not everyone is the same. And my goodness, wouldn't that be a boring place if we were? It's listening. The next point that I've got here is listening to what's being said and what's not being said. Not everyone is comfortable speaking up because of fear of judgment, because of fear of being targeted. So it's seeing the unseen. And this means for you, if you're a manager or leader, it's getting really good within yourself, because the better you are within you, the more you will spot and more you will observe the unseen, because you're no longer restricted by lack of self-worth within yourself, lack of, belief, because when you've got your own insecurities, you filter everything else through that. Now, normalizing flexibility. It's looking at opportunity for remote work, flexible hours, quiet spaces, removing assumptions on what a certain day or a certain outcome has to look like. So when we talk about valuing outcomes over the way it's achieved is really important, because if you've got something, a task that needs to be achieved, and you've delegated, but you're worried if even you spot something that isn't on how you thought it should be done, you still perhaps, if you feel like there needs to be more support and management, consider looking at, okay, you have a conversation with the person, you look at the actual ultimate outcome, the work that needs to be done, and then you actually ask them, okay, what do you view as the best way to achieve this? What support do you need? If anything, is there any issues or challenges that might come up through doing this way? So you can preempt things and work through, but it also means you're supporting different ways of thinking, different approaches, which is absolutely vital. This, in fact, actually creates stronger teams. It's proven, and I know I mentioned it in the last one, but I really want you to hear this fact. If you've already heard it on the last one, is neurodiverse teams that really lean into that are 30% more effective. Okay, because when you've got people that are really owning things, really in their flow, how much better does everything work? It's a powerful place to be in. Being authentic and transparent yourself, being able to receive feedback, and this connects on to addressing ableism proactively. Now, I've noticed it's looking at feedback channels, because if people don't feel safe to give feedback or have conversation, it won't come up. It's looking at creating different ways for people to share their views or their thoughts or their observations anonymously as well, because some people may not be ready to make themselves known with what they think. So it's creating a platform where everyone can have a say. And then that takes me through on to look at what languaging works, because different environments, and I've worked with numerous organizations, and every single team has a different form and different languaging that they are happy with, that is more acceptable, that feels better for them, because we are all unique and all individual. So look at the types of languaging that people feel that flags something up for them. And this is not pandering to people's needs or softening things or woke. There's a big difference between people making excuses for bad behavior and genuinely wanting to be considered for their views, where it's come from, because who's to say how a person should think or should attach a meaning to things? And this is where we can work through what languaging fits well with different scenarios, different conversations, what causes negative connotation, negative meaning, and why that might raise something for the person, but also being aware that some people might not even be ready or willing to talk about things, and respecting that as well. So big topics. We'll unpack all of this further as we go along, because right through there's so many things that can be isolated into different episodes themselves. But this is, like I say, it's just a very high level. It's an overview. So just to summarize, is to consider what masking is it's that action of where you have to suppress your natural self. It's looking at ableism, where that comes from, the slight subtle comments, through to the generalized institution and the way things are done and set in stone, when really do they have to be set in stone? It's looking at supporting the individual, supporting an organization, developing the person and the whole that the person exists within. So if you've got views, comments, I would love to hear from them. If there's anything that you want to hear about or share from your own experience, love to hear that too, because we all have different knowledge, different examples, different meanings, and they are all valid. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.